make a start. Hopefully there's some people here for this webinar today. We're talking about meaningful participation of children and young people in decisions about their care. I'm going to speak for the first 5 to 7 minutes, and then I'll hand over to Lorna and Chloe, who'll introduce themselves. So some of the objectives of today, which we're going to cover over the next sort of hour and 15 minutes, are what do we mean by children's participation? We're going to feed back findings from 3 sort of different studies that have been carried out around this subject of meaningful participation. We're going to discuss in particular the barriers and enablers of ensuring that children and young people have an opportunity to participate meaningfully in reviews and meetings with professionals and decision making. And we're going to consider how we can improve practice in relation to children's participation. Just to say, you can ask questions at any time via the Twitter @ExchangeWales #meaningfulexchange. We're going to have little sections at the end of each talk where we'll then answer the questions, but if you pose questions at any point, then we'll come to them at different points in the talk. Okay, so some of the things we're going to think about today are theoretical and practical questions, such as what do we mean by participation, because in some ways it is slightly contested as a concept. What's the aim and purpose of participation? Why is participation important for young people and indeed parents? What counts as effective participation? How do we know that we're ensuring young people and families participate meaningfully in social work practice? How do we evaluate? How do we work out whether participation is happening and the extent to which it's happening? And critically, who participates in whose space under whose rules? So if we're talking about children in care reviews, where are those meetings taking place? Who's deciding where they're taking place? Who decides when they're taking place? And who is in charge of the way the meeting runs, so the agenda and who comes? We're going to talk quite a lot more about those points as the morning goes on. I just want to say, this is mainly aimed at practitioners, so I'm not going to talk a great deal about theory and research in terms of general theory at the start of the session at least, but I just wanted to mention 2 key ways of looking at participation. And the first one is the ladder of participation, which was derived initially from Arnstein, and then Roger Hart picked this up, particularly in relation to children. And if we think about children in care reviews, you could say that reviews could take place on different parts of the scale. So in the research that we carried out, we found that a lot of the reviews were pretty tokenistic. So children and young people weren't involved in deciding where the reviews took place. They weren't involved in when the reviews take place. They weren't involved in who was going to be invited or what was going to be on the agenda. So that is right down the bottom of Hart's ladder, sort of tokenism and decoration, maybe even manipulation. Now, there were some good examples of children participating meaningfully, and we'll talk about this later in reviews. So, for example, where children chaired their own reviews, where they then played a key role in deciding what was on the agenda, who was invited, when the meeting took place, and where it took place. So that would clearly be at the higher echelons of the ladder of participation. Child initiated and directed, child initiated shared decisions with adults. And that's what I would say is we should be aiming for whenever possible. Of course, there are challenges to this, and we'll come to those later. There's other ways, theories around participation, and this is another key one from Professor Nigel Thomas, who suggested that when thinking about participation, this climbing wall is a good concept. And I would agree that this, again, is an important concept to consider when we're thinking about participation and meaningful participation. So thinking about children again in children in care reviews, to what extent do they get their voice? Do they have their voice heard? To what extent do professionals listen to what they've got to say, take into account what they've got to say, and whenever possible, act upon what they want to happen? To what extent are they supported by the social worker, by the IRO, by the advocate? That's going to be another key point in this. Information, so do they know? Do they understand the purpose of the meeting? Why everyone's there? Do they have any control over the meeting, over who attends? Do they have a choice over when the meeting is going to take place, and again, who attends? And finally, do they have much autonomy in the decision making? So these, as I say, is another sort of theoretical way of looking at participation, particularly I think is helpful in relation to children care reviews, although you could relate it to other forms of decision making. And what we're looking for, again, ideally, is children to have a voice, be supported to give their voice, to have clear information about things like when the meeting is taking place and where it's going to take place, and a role in making those decisions, have some control over that, and also autonomy and choice. So this, again, I think is a way of measuring and thinking about, or maybe measuring is rather considering the extent to which we are giving young people the chance to participate in decision making. Okay, the clicker stopped. Shall we? Oh, it's gone. Good. So I just want to finish off with a few final points before I'm going to pass on to Chloe and Lorna. Why is children's participation important? Well, there's a few very key reasons that the different researchers have argued. So obviously, Dickens et al. Argue that it could be seen as a protective factor, and it leads to their confidence, self-efficacy and self-worth. So if you have a child who's experienced abuse or neglect, then they come into care, and then once they come into care, all the decisions made about them are made by the professionals around them, and they don't play any role in that, then that's likely to decrease their confidence further, and it's likely to decrease their sense of self-worth. Whereas if they're playing a leading role, a key role in decision making, then that's much more likely to increase their self-confidence and self-worth. That's the argument there. From a sort of children's rights perspective, this is a good quote, I think, from Schofield and Thoburn. Participation by children matters because it's an acknowledgement of their civil rights, and because without listening to children and understanding how they experience the world, how can we begin to determine what will ensure their protection and enable them to grow into healthy adults? So really important from a rights perspective, from a children's rights perspective, from a civil rights perspective, that we hear children's voices, and again, that we understand their experiences, in part to ensure that we protect them and support them to grow into being healthy adults. Other arguments is, and this sort of links to the first point I made, maltreated children who do not feel involved may be left with feelings of powerlessness. So this sense of powerlessness, this sense of neglect, will continue from being, first of all, pre-care experiences if they've suffered abuse and neglect at the hands of their birth family, and then continuing then when they come into care, and it's really critical to avoid that. And of course it will improve practice and decision making of the agency, both in relation to individual children, but at a more strategic level, if we're listening to children at all times and taking their opinions into account. Okay, so I'm going to pass on now to Lorna and Chloe to talk about the next part of this webinar.
Hi, so I'm going to talk about a review that we've been carrying out as part of the What Works Centre programme, which is a wider review. It's a realist review looking at family participation in meetings and how to create kind of shared decision making. Part of the review looked at how children can be involved in meetings and how they can be involved meaningfully in decision making about their lives. So I'm going to very briefly talk about the method. I'm going to try and not make it too academic, but just to give you an understanding quickly of the realist perspective that we took. And then Chloe's going to talk through how you prepare for the meeting and what happens during the meeting. And I'll talk a little bit about how you can incorporate children and young people who don't want to attend meetings, but keep their voice kind of live throughout that meeting process. And then after the meeting, kind of what follow-up needs to be done to make sure that that participation was meaningful and can kind of continue to inform decisions. So, in terms of the method, as I said, we took a realist approach. So the realist approach is not just looking at which interventions work, but how the interventions work and who they work for, and why they might work for someone. So rather than looking at a theory that might exist that's relevant to participation, like some of the ones that Clive has talked about, it's actually looking at building a theory that works, that helps us to understand what might work in that particular circumstance. So obviously young people in care, young people involved with social workers, decision making and participation is different for them than it would be for young people at school, for example, or young people within their family. It may also be different for older young people than it is for young children. So by taking the realist approach, we can start to build theories about what might work and what might not work in certain circumstances for different children and young people. So in order to do that, we build an initial theory from the literature, So looking at all literature that has evaluated programs that involve children and young people, or in our case, more widely, families in decision making in a different way, and actually where that literature is explicit about mechanisms, so things that might be happening that could work and help that intervention to work better in that situation. So for example, we might be looking at not just whether or not that intervention, such as a family group conference, was successful, but what it helped the families do differently, or what the social worker did differently, and what that then changed for the family that helped that intervention work. So that's the first stage of the review, and then the second stage is speaking with practitioners, young people, people who've actually experienced a similar intervention, and asking them if it makes sense, and if it fits with their experience, and then building into the theory their experiences and their words. So on the slides, it's not that clear, but we worked with a young people's group who all have experience of being in care and also have experience of going to meetings, and asked them, just for different stages of the kind of meeting process, what it is that they think would enable them to take part in decisions, and if they had been involved in decisions, what that would feel like for them. So this is just an example of one of them that was filled out. So at the bottom here it says, after the meeting, if you did feel involved and empowered in the meeting, how would that feel for you afterwards? So, you know, this young person had answered it would make them feel happy, they would feel listened to, they would feel involved. So that's some of the young people's outcomes that we were looking at. So there's just a link there, if anyone, the slides will be available so you can copy it down later, to some of the other work that we've done in this area. So a recent review on science and safety, and also the scoping review that identified these interventions before we started this review. So they're both freely available on the What Works Centre website. And this is very complicated, and I won't talk you through all of it, but this is our final kind of program theory that we've developed through the literature and through consultation that looks at the different kind of points, the different pathways, so these different mechanistic pathways that work for young people through meetings, and the different stages that those happen at. So we've got kind of the before meeting point, where actually it's really important to give young people enough time to be kind of prepared to really understand what's going on within a meeting. And then during the meeting, so what actually happens when they're sat in that room, and then after, so what is the kind of follow-up in that, like from that meeting. So you can kind of see there's these three kind of key pathways that cut across. So the first one is about collaboration and engagement. So how do you actually work with a young person to truly collaborate and share power and help them to really feel like they're a part of that meeting? So what do you need to do beforehand? What needs to happen during that, and what needs to happen after to kind of keep that mechanism in play? The second one, as long as you can read sideways, is about building trust and reducing shame. So what has to happen in order for that to be activated? So what needs to happen in order for a young person to really trust that if they come along to a meeting, you know, that won't be a situation that feels overwhelming or humiliating or stigmatizing for them. And then the third mechanism is about how they can then be, if you have those two kind of mechanisms working, how they can then be enabled to take part in decisions. So actually without shifting the kind of power balance and without reducing the kind of stigma around meetings, it's very hard to get to a point where they can be meaningfully involved in decisions. And actually one of the things that we discovered looking at the literature and talking to people is that the outcomes that we're looking for from children or young people's participation in meetings may be quite different from what we're looking for from family participation. So actually our final outcome here, if you can see that, is that one of the most important things that can come from children and young people's participation is that they actually understand the outcome of the meeting and the plan. So it's not, they're not waiting for someone to tell them what's happened. They've been there, they can understand the process and how a decision was reached. So even if the decision isn't the one that they would have chosen, they can feel more empowered and feel like they understand the process and how the decision was reached, and actually possibly more empowered to challenge that decision in the future if they want to. So I'm just going to pass you on to Chloe now, who's going to talk through in a bit more detail about what these different stages mean and what you actually have to do at each stage.
This first slide here that I'm going to speak about is the sort of preconditions that need to be in place before the meeting takes place. So these are sort of the enabling conditions, if you like. So to establish this context, the social worker or the coordinator, depending on who's organising and arranging the meeting, needs to have a good relationship with the child or young person. And this is likely to be achieved over time, so not just meeting them half an hour before the meeting takes place, but actually having several visits with them. It might be the case that the social worker already has a good relationship with the child or young person, but if it's a coordinator or someone else that's arranging the meeting, it might be the case that several visits need to happen. If they are able to create this relationship between them and the young person, then they're able to find out what the child or the person would like from the meeting, how they can best have their say if they would like to attend the meeting, or if not, maybe ensuring that an advocate or someone else can represent their views, whether they're present or whether they don't wish to be present. Some of the skills then that we found to be essential for helping this process and in helping this enabling context to happen was having excellent listening skills, flexible communication with the young people depending on their needs, being open and honest, and what we found to be really important was actually not raising unrealistic expectations about what the meeting might involve and the decisions that need to be made. We also found that being able to use creative methods as well with the young person or the child. So if they maybe don't wish to be present, or they do but they don't wish to talk, then some drawing sort of activities that could be done beforehand that then could be shared during the meeting. Having that ability to pick and choose really different ways to help the young person become involved. And even having those discussions around whether the meeting can be recorded or Skyped if they can't attend. This next stage is around preparation, so it's again still before the meeting, and this essentially involves collaboration between the young person or the child and then the social worker or the coordinator. It's about preparing them for what the meeting is actually going to be about, what might be said about them at the meeting, so it doesn't become a shock if they turn up and they don't expect something to be raised and then it is. And it's also about giving them choices around different aspects of the meeting. So whether they wish to actually attend the meeting in the first place, what information is shared and in front of which people that will be shared in front of, when and where the meeting will be held, so giving them some sort of decision over where it's going to be held, so whether that's outside of school, for example. Who will be present at the meeting, so they might want a certain family member or someone they know that they trust to be present at the meeting, and whether they would like to actually chair the meeting themselves, so giving that autonomy to be involved in that respect. And then allowing them the opportunity as well to leave at any point, so if they start to feel uncomfortable, it's giving them those sorts of choices where they feel they've got ownership over the meeting process. Because if these sorts of things maybe aren't managed, then it's less likely that the child or young person is going to want to attend. There's a couple of things on this slide as well that can help enable this sense of ownership to be created, or actually inhibit it. So the social worker, again, being honest about the meeting purpose, which goes back to not raising expectations and being open with them. So that's part of the preparatory process. And then if you look at the red box, the professional setting expectations on how children should behave was coming up as something that actually would hinder whether the young person felt ownership, because they're told this, they're told that, and they actually don't feel like they've been given any choices over different aspects of the meeting. So lastly then, assuming that the previous processes have been successful, you hope the young person feels comfortable and prepared and actually indeed confident in being able to engage in the meeting and want to attend. So for example, if they do have that positive relationship with the social worker or the coordinator or a person who they trust, who knows will be present at the meeting, they can actually feel safe in attending, knowing that they have someone there to support them, particularly if things become overwhelming. They know, for example, they can leave the room. They can also feel less stigmatised as well, so if they're given choices over when and where the meeting's held. For example, the young people in the consultation we did spoke about actually not having the meetings in school, and that was a real important issue that they raised, and that contributed to them feeling less stigmatised if they weren't taken out of class and things like that. So these are all different possibilities of how young people might be feeling through that preparation process for the meeting, and that hopefully allows them to engage in the meeting process. So once they, assuming that the preparatory process has been successful and they're feeling positive about attending, it's about making sure then the tone of the meeting is right so that they feel comfortable enough to share their views when they're there. So where possible, it's only having relevant people who are known to the child attend the meeting. That allows them to feel more comfortable and more reassured that they know who to expect there. And then it also is what an interesting point was raised about, was only having the relevant people attend the relevant parts. So something that the young people in particular in the consultation spoke about, actually maybe only having those people concerning health or school come into the meeting for those particular bits, so that they didn't feel that information about themselves was being shared unnecessarily to people who maybe don't need to know those parts and things like that. It was them having some autonomy over what information about them is shared to people and who to. Another thing is about young people feeling that they're able to make decisions about their own care. So feeling that they can say what they need to succeed and being able to make decisions about their own care can be achieved if they gain those insights about themselves. So if they make decisions, if they've been involved in decision making, and other professionals and family members have also said and shared the information, then the young people can feel more confident in saying what they feel is needed, and they can actually make decisions about their own care because they've heard everyone's views, and with an advocate present as well, and knowing that what might be shared about them, either through the advocate or themselves, they can feel informed and represented. And then that leads to the last three blue boxes at the bottom, around young people then feeling that they've been listened to and involved, they've had a chance to be involved in decision making, they've heard everyone's views, they feel they have some control over the decisions regarding them, and they also have been a part of creating an accessible and clear plan, allocated tasks and responsibilities and time frames have been agreed by everyone, and importantly the child and young person has been involved in that, so they know then what to expect from family members or professionals following that meeting. There hasn't got to be another meeting to inform the child and young person of the outcome, because they've actually been there and they've agreed to it as well. So as part of being involved in these decisions leads to obviously further things that happen after the meeting, which Lorna will discuss in a minute. But lastly, I just want to talk about some of the barriers and enablers then that can either inhibit or facilitate the involvement of children and young people during the meeting. So some of the barriers that we found were adults interrupting their young person. So if they speak over them, they talk about them rather than to them, and don't give them enough space to actually say what they want to. The second one is around family conflict. If there's disputes or tension within the family, the young person can maybe feel quite uneasy with where their loyalty might lie, or even if there's professional conflict as well. Having difficult conversations, so sometimes difficult conversations arise during these meetings, and for example, family members say in front of the child that they cannot or won't care for them, that can inhibit the young person either wanting to attend or actually wanting to attend further meetings or leaving the current meeting that they're in. If there are police are present, that can cause a lot of even adults to feel uneasy. So for a child and young person especially, that was found to make them to feel uneasy, and then people might not necessarily say what they wanted to because they know the police are present. And lastly, if family members or even professionals don't actually turn up to the meeting, so if the child or young person is expecting certain people there and they don't show, the child can actually feel a sense of rejection there as well. So that's part of, again, not raising the young person's expectations. If you know they're perhaps a family member who often doesn't show up for things, it's actually making the young person aware that that might be the case, so you don't create false expectations for them. Some of the enablers now. I skipped one ahead too far. Let's go back. Oh, I am so terrible with technology.
It's a little bit delayed.
Yeah, I mean I clicked
Do you
it
want
twice.
me to? Hang on, if you stop clicking.
I don't really know where I have to point it to. Is it
Back.
here?
There you go.
Lovely, thank you.
I'll manually change it for you.
So some of the enablers then that would assist young people and children to be involved in the meeting is the language used and the environment, so tailoring that to the individual so that they can understand and participate, particularly if you've got a child or young person with special educational needs, making sure you're talking to them rather than about them or over the top of them, making sure you acknowledge that they're there and that they are understanding each part of the process. Not skipping along like too fast, for example, and moving on to the next item on the agenda. Secondly is around the child and young person ask for their views throughout the meeting, not at a set point, so it's not about just letting them speak at the start. Once they've had their say, that's it, all the decisions are then made with everyone else in the room and they aren't involved. It's actually asking and checking throughout the meeting. The next one is about the child and young person being given space and time. So some young people and children might have an advocate speaking on behalf of them, or they might wish to speak themselves. And it's just being conscious that this might be a nervous thing for them to attend, and they may take slightly longer to get their views across. And it's just giving them that space and time to speak freely without people interrupting them or telling them to hurry up, for example. And lastly, again, is around that having that advocate present, which can really enable children and young people to feel comfortable during the meeting and sharing their views. Their advocate can meet with the young person, like we said beforehand, and discuss what the child or young person might want to say, especially if there's difficult things. So that can be really reassuring for the child or young person to know that there is someone there who will represent their views, and they don't actually have to have those difficult conversations with family members, for example, that someone else would do it on their behalf. So that's the end of the meeting process, and now we're going to move on to talk to what happens then after the meeting, which Lorna's going to discuss.
As we've talked about, the meeting, it's not just a one-off meeting that a child is involved with. Being involved in decision making is an ongoing process, so from preparation at the start all the way through what actually happens in the meeting, and even more so, almost, what happens after the meeting. So even if the meeting has been a positive experience, if that's not followed up, it can actually end up being quite a detrimental experience. So after the meeting, a young person can, if the meeting has gone well and has kind of followed a kind of positive and empowering pathway, then the young person can feel some positive outcomes. So in yellow here, we've got what we call kind of mechanisms. So it's about how the young person feels, what they then know. So here we've got the child or young person can feel more confident. They can know that they have support because they've seen who's actually come to the meeting. Obviously the reverse of that is if people haven't shown up, that can make them feel more isolated. The child or young person can feel a sense of togetherness with their family. If everyone's managed to come together and come up with a plan and be involved in decisions, actually that can be quite, can actually kind of galvanise like the young person's feeling of being part of a family. The child or young person can feel valued, like what they had to say was really important. So they weren't just there to kind of say, give one piece of information, but actually what they said had an impact on what happened in the meeting. The child or young person can feel really proud of their involvement. Some of the literature talked about children and young people who've been involved in creative ways in meetings, where they may have written a poem or submitted a video for people to watch during the meeting, and that was particularly powerful when they really thought that everyone had a negative perspective of them, and actually when they felt they had, they were perceived in a negative way, they managed to write a poem and people really were emotionally quite moved by it. They felt really proud of what they'd managed to achieve. They can feel really powerful. Again, you can feel happy and also just relieved that it's over. If it's been a positive experience, actually the build-up beforehand can be quite intense for a young person or a family. And actually just getting through it and it having been positive can cause quite a big sense of relief and actually possibly reduce that anxiety for future meetings. So some of the kind of outcomes that can happen from that is that the child or young person can be involved in monitoring the plan. So if they truly understand what happened, what decisions were made, and they feel like they were part of those decisions, it can be quite powerful to include a child or young person in actually following up. So when someone's offered some kind of support, they could be a key part in checking with that person, saying, well, did you make that referral yet? Or do you remember when you said you were going to be able to come around once a week? And that can be quite powerful for professionals and other family members to keep them on board with the commitments that they've made. As I said earlier, one of the most important outcomes for a child or young person from participating in a meeting is that they can actually understand what's happened. They can understand what the plan is going forward and kind of what decisions have been made. They can also gain, so this is some of the interesting parts that came out of the literature that was specific just to children and young people, was that they found that they gained transferable skills. So actually just being able to stand up in front of a room full of professionals and family members, potentially in quite a high conflict situation, and have your say and really be involved and think about quite complex information and evaluate it and then help people reach a decision can be really, really important in terms of other life areas, so in employment, in school and university, and it can help young people to gain skills and confidence that are transferable to other areas. And also it can help a child or young person be more likely to attend a meeting. So I guess if it's a positive meeting, they've felt involved, they've felt like something's happened, and based on what they've said, then they're more likely to go again to a different meeting. The reverse of that is every negative experience that a young person has of these meetings could reduce the likelihood of them actually being involved. So when we talk about children and young people don't want to be involved in meetings, maybe it's more about the actual way that meetings are held and the way that people involved in the meetings that they've experienced so far that makes them reluctant to go along to other meetings. Oh, skipped. There's an extra one. There we go. And another thing that makes kind of children and young people's involvement slightly different from other professionals or adults who might be involved in the meeting is that it's completely legitimate for a child or young person to decide, after being given all of the information, after having enough time to be prepared, and after being offered an advocate, that they actually just don't want to attend the meeting, and that's completely fine. But what that doesn't mean is that they shouldn't be involved in the decision making that might happen. So actually there are lots of things that can be done that can allow a child or young person to still be involved in the meeting and still be considered when decisions are being taken, not just in terms of their best interest, but actually in terms of their own views and their own words. So we looked at certain areas of this. So the first one is preparation. So actually, a child can't make an informed decision about whether or not they want to attend if they've not been given the right preparation in the first place. So a child or young person should be given the same amount of preparation in terms of understanding the purpose of the meeting, then a child who decides they don't want to go, then they do want to go, or if they don't want to go. So actually, if you still prepare them, even if they've decided not to go, they can then decide how to submit some kind of information to the meeting, or how they want to follow up, or if they want to go to a future meeting. An advocate can still be used even if the young person doesn't go to the meeting. So if an advocate meets with the young person beforehand and writes down in their words what they want to say, that young person can also then understand that their words are being used in the meeting and at which points they're being used in the meeting, even if they don't want to go themselves. As we kind of mentioned earlier, there can be flexibility around how a child or young person can express their views. So we talked about children and young people almost interchangeably, but actually young children, despite possibly not being able to speak up as much in a meeting, can be involved in really creative ways that can help adults and young people, adults and professionals understand their perspectives. So quite often a picture can be very emotive and can help people within a meeting think about what's important to that child and actually hold that as a really important part of the decision-making process. One of the things that also came up from the literature and young people that we spoke to was that technology can be used much more than it is now. So a young person may not want to take time out of school and go along to a meeting, or even just be in that kind of room, but they can use Skype or FaceTime in order to actually be present within the meeting, but not physically there. And this is something that isn't used very often at the moment. It could also allow family members who possibly can't take time off work or travel from a different part of the country or abroad to be involved in the meeting from a distance. I think we can be a lot more creative about the technology that we use in these types of meetings. And then the final thing was that it's really important for young people who don't attend meetings to have feedback about what happened, but in a way that actually covers everything that happened, the types of decisions that were made and how those decisions were reached, rather than just being told the outcome. So one young person suggested that the meeting could be recorded so that children and young people could see and hear exactly what was said, rather than it being filtered through different people's interpretations. Quite often young people will get lots of different people's views about what happened, but actually will never get the chance to see, well, exactly what had happened. So if they are allowed to be at the meeting, potentially there is a way that it could be recorded and shown to them, rather than someone just telling them afterwards what happened.
Thank you very much. So, there's two main studies I'm going to talk about. So the first study is around interviews predominantly with young people, but also foster carers. So we interviewed, this is an authority, so the research I'm going to talk about was carried out in two separate authorities. This was in the first authority in England that got a good Ofsted rating across the board, including for looked after children. We interviewed 25 looked after children and 16 foster carers. It's a qualitative study. So the aim of the study was to explore how far, the extent to which children and young people understand the process and purpose of children in care reviews, and how, or whether they're able to meaningfully participate in these meetings. So the key findings, we've broken them down into three main sort of themes. So understanding of the process, so the extent to which young people understood the children in care review process, their engagement in the process, and what were the barriers and enablers to participation for young people. So first of all, understanding of the meeting. So unfortunately, of the 25 young people, most of them didn't realise the purpose of the children in care review. Most we had lots of different answers. One said I think they're about school. Some of them did have a clear understanding of the IRO role, but they still didn't understand, for example, that a key part of the children in care review is to review the care plan and put in place some actions following the care plan to ensure it goes forward. There were some that had a slightly better understanding. So a quote from an older young person said, if you didn't have them, then you wouldn't know who to see or what to do, and nothing would be changed. So there was a sense that this was an important meeting for some young people and could lead to changes, But the central objective, if you like, of the Children Care Review, which is to review the care plan and ensure that things are on track and working well, none of the young people identified that as a part of the review. So they were divided. Generally, they were fairly negative about the usefulness of the review. Some young people, particularly if they'd been in care and in relatively settled care for a very long period of time, then they were particularly negative about the purpose of reviews. There was a sense that they made them feel different, that they felt different enough having being in care, and then these meetings sort of compounded that sense of being different to young people who weren't in care. So I've been with the carers for 8 years. It's not like I need all of that. So, they were very settled, this young person. They didn't need these constant reviews. In fact, this young person would have wanted social workers and independent reviewing officers just to leave them alone. A bit more positive quotes. So if you didn't have them, you wouldn't know who to see or what to do, and nothing would be changed. Sometimes, but again, some more negative quotes. Sometimes there isn't really anything you want to put across. So a sense of a sort of pointlessness to the meeting. A very common view, particularly in terms of engagement in the actual meeting itself, was a sense that they were boring. So we did some of the young people did some drawings during the interviews, and this one young person drew a picture of him bored with headphones in his ears during the review, and he said, look, I go for reviews because I feel I should, but I tend to wear headphones during them because I find them so boring. So obviously that's a pretty negative perception of meetings. Adolescents, so those young people who are a bit older, so we interviewed young people between the ages of 8 and 17, and the adolescent older young people tended to find these meetings a mixture of being awkward and sort of hard work. So I don't like attending those meetings. It's awkward. They ask you the same questions over and over again. They're hard work, and I just want them out of the way. So again, pretty negative. Both young people finding them boring, adolescents feeling them awkward and a pain and unnecessary. In terms of the extent to which young people felt involved in the process of the meeting, so in deciding what was on the agenda, what they were going to talk about, when it was going to take place, most young people didn't feel very involved in that. So looking back at the Hart's ladder of participation, it would have been on a level of sort of tokenism at best. So the IROs come with their own agenda. It's just their agenda, really. At my last review, random people started turning up, and I was like, who are you? I don't know who they were. So that was a real problem for a lot of the 25 young people we interviewed. The majority said that often young people would professionals would come to the meeting who they didn't know. They didn't know who they were. They didn't know why they're at the meeting, and they found this a real put-off in terms of participating meaningfully. Some young people said they would have liked the meeting to have taken place in a different context, so rather than sort of sitting around a formal meeting. One said, I would have had it on a roller coaster. I'd like to see him on a roller coaster. Some young people said, in a totally different, sort of less formal venue, in a park, that sort of thing. In terms of barriers and enablers that young people talked about, jump forward. So one of the big barriers, linking in with what I've already said about the meetings being boring and sort of a tick box exercise, is that a lot of the young people talked about the bureaucratic element to the meeting, the set agenda. Some of them said, it's a set agenda that even the IRO and the social worker doesn't decide on. It's decided by the IT forms, which is true in some local authorities. There's a set agenda which has to be covered, which is set out in the IT forms, and young people were aware of that. So they said they're okay, well, they happen, everything is boring, but they have to be done. So this notion of them just constantly happening. And again, a misunderstanding, it's just about school. How's school? Tell me about your health. Are you happy? And again, a sense of young people in care constantly being asked the same question over and over again. Before the reviews, during the reviews, after the reviews, in visits by social workers and other professionals, constantly being asked, are you happy? Are you healthy? How's school? And they were just bored of these constant sort of routine questions, which were the same question over and over again, particularly if there was a high turnover of social workers. They'd have to answer these questions over and over again, which they found incredibly dull, which is understandable. Okay, so in relation to the IRO role, A very worrying finding, and this is a bit negative in relation to IROs in this particular authority, is 24% of the children and young people we interviewed, so nearly a quarter, did not know who their IRO was and didn't understand the role of the IRO. So that, is obviously very concerning that they didn't know who their IRO was. Drift, so again, young people said that, they'd had the reviews. Foster carers also said this. An action would be agreed, for example, therapeutic support, or even something like a passport so they could go on holiday with their foster carers, or various different actions. And often these actions wouldn't take place; they just wouldn't happen. Particularly if it was around therapeutic actions, and foster carers particularly picked up on that. They also young people felt that the IRO didn't really challenge the social worker about things that they hadn't done properly. So, for example, if they hadn't visited regularly, if the social worker hadn't done what they said they were going to do, they didn't feel like the IRO was challenging them, either in the meeting or before or after the meeting. So that then led to this sense of drift continuing on and on. Foster carers were much more positive about IROs, as were some young people, and I'll come on to that shortly. So one foster carer said, "I love it when they sit down with X, they really do their job well." So foster care is a bit more positive about the IROs in this study. But there were some positive examples. So in this authority, it's a relatively small authority, about 120 children, so we interviewed a good number of them, 25. There was clearly one IRO, and it was the same IRO again and again, who was a lot more creative, and he would routinely see young people before the reviews. He'd take them out for a milkshake, he'd go for a kickabout in the park with them, do something with them, an activity with them that they liked doing either before the review or a couple of weeks before the review. And that made a real difference. So the young people who had this particular IRO were much more positive about the way they were able to engage with him on a personal level, but also more widely in the review process. So that was interesting. A real issue for young people was in terms of the attendees at the meeting. Young people felt particularly strongly that they didn't want teachers at the review meeting. They found that very difficult. They didn't want the teachers turning up at their houses, knowing where they lived, knowing intimate details about what was going well and what wasn't going well in their lives. They also felt that foster carers, social workers, often they didn't realise that the foster carers, social workers were their social workers. They often thought they were the foster carers' friends. And this again was a pretty worrying finding. So they were saying, who are these people, the foster carers' friends? They just turn up at the meeting, they sit there, they don't really say or do much, and I don't know why they're there listening to all these intimate details about my life. And they found that very dispiriting. So a very positive outcome of this research was in this authority, we stopped foster carers, social workers coming to the meetings, and young people did say after that they felt the meetings were much better. They didn't want random people, and we also stopped school staff coming unless it was a great need for that to happen. So we did during the interviews, we did some drawings with young people. They did some drawings and they put who they would like in the meetings and who was in the meeting. So this was a list of all the people who was in this young person's meeting. So the foster carer, social worker, the dad, the carer, the other carer, the social worker, the IRO, the mum, the sister, another professional, lots of people. And this made them feel bored and confused. You can see the drawing there, bored and confused. And they didn't like this large meeting. It definitely didn't help them participate. When we asked them, it didn't help them meaningfully participate, who they'd actually want at the meeting, they definitely didn't want, as I said, the foster carer social worker there, much smaller meeting, they didn't want the school there, they just wanted their foster carer there, their mum and dad there, the IRO there and the social worker. So there was something about having smaller meetings. And as I say, in a very positive way, we did change the practice in this authority, so that was really good. In terms of conclusions from this study, some conclusions. So, one of the key points that both young people and foster carers talked about was is this, and our analysis of the data was, is this a child-focused meeting or a professional-centred meeting? What is the purpose of a children in care review? We know what the IRO handbook says, which is to review the care plan, but has it become too focused on ticking boxes on the professional element of the review rather than focusing on what the young person wants, on celebrating the young person's life, or what they've done over the last 6 months? And is the whole purpose of this meeting just far too based on what the professionals need and want from this meeting? Do the young people understand who all the people are there, what they're doing there, why the meeting's taking place? Well, the answer tended to be to those questions, no. They weren't clear who these people were, what the real purpose of the meeting was. They'd never seen their care plan. They often weren't aware they even had a care plan. So that was a big problem. Preparation and choice, as I say, there was this one particular IRO who made much more efforts and was much more creative around preparation and choice, did meet the young people often before the reviews, was much more creative in the way the reviews took place, and that made a big difference. And that IRO and good social workers were clearly remembered, and that was very positive. I want to finish, in terms of this study, on dream social workers. So all 25 young people had had quite a few social workers during their period in care and prior to coming to care. But what was interesting is, and they all had had social workers that they didn't feel were particularly good at their jobs and didn't feel they did what they said they were going to do. But they did also all have what we'd call dream social workers. So they all said they'd had at least one or maybe two social workers who they felt were really good at their jobs. The key things that made young people, and I think this is an important finding, sort of dream or really good social workers, really competent social workers, were that they did what they said they were going to do. So if they were going to sort something out, like a passport, like a DBS form for their friends, parents, so they could go and visit their friend, extra contact with their family, they went ahead and did it, and they sort of fought their corner, and they a sense of getting things done. Another interesting finding, which I haven't seen in other studies, and is interesting, I guess, is they felt it was important that that social workers were sort of younger, that they understood them, that they were trendy, so that they wore nice clothes. And we said after this, we said to the department involved, well, you ought to give your social workers an extra clothing allowance so they can dress in a very posh way, because young people said that they liked it when their social workers were well dressed, which is interesting. They also liked it if they had nice cars, so they didn't like going in social workers' cars where the social worker car was messy or dirty. They wanted nice, modern, up-to-date cars. They wanted the social worker to be aware of the music and the things that they were interested in. And this sense of being a sort of young, trendy social worker was really important to them. And obviously other things that come out in other studies, being kind, being strong, being on their side was really important. But it was really positive that they'd all had at least one really good social worker. Okay, so I'm going to now move on to the next study, which was in a different local authority. This local authority had a slightly less good Ofsted inspection, but it still had requiring improvement for looked after children, which is pretty average, better than inadequate. And in this local authority, we interviewed 10 young people, 11 social workers, 8 independent reviewing officers, and 7 senior managers. Again, looking at participation, looking at children in care reviews. But also, this study came up with much wider sort of problems around the system, systemic failures that I'm going to talk about. So there were some major barriers around children in care being engaged in decision making, both in reviews but more generally. One of the big barriers was high turnover of staff. So all the young people raised the high number of social workers they had. One young person said, this was a young person who's 15, I've had 3 social workers since I've been in care. Oh, this young person had only been in care about 9 months at the time of this interview. In my whole life, probably about 20. So this sense of constant turnover of social workers. One of the positive things is that none of these 10 young people had had such a high turnover of IROs. In fact, they'd all had, bar one, the same IRO throughout their period in care. And that made the IRO a very important person in their lives, because if they had 4 social workers in the year, they just realised and decided, well, what's the point in building up a relationship with this person? They're going to be left in a few months. Whereas the IRO stuck around, they were there often for years, and they played a really important role, particularly if they had a good relationship. So this, as I say, was a different local authority, and these young people were more positive generally about their IRO. Another issue was, as well as high staff turnover, was inexperienced workforce. So this was a quote from an IRO. A lot of social workers don't really know what to expect from a child in care review. Not all, but obviously you've got a lot of newly qualified social workers through, and we have a lot of turnover of social workers. So a feeling from the IROs was, particularly the newly qualified social workers, at this point in this authority, 60% of the social workers had qualified in the last 16 months, didn't really understand the purpose of the review, and often hadn't completed. In fact, care plans were virtually never completed in this authority, which is remarkable. And often they would ask during the review the IRO to explain the plan and indeed come up with the plan. You know, so that's very problematic because it should be the social worker coming with the care plan, only the care plan, and then the reviewing the care plan. But in this situation we had IROs being told, well, can you come up with a plan, and can you then tell the young person and the parents what the plan's going to be, which is obviously very problematic. Another big barrier was lack of understanding and training and participation. So a lot of professionals we interviewed, including senior managers and social workers, IROs had a better understanding of participation, but a lot of social workers and senior managers didn't really understand what meaningful participation is. So one quote here from a senior manager: "Participation to me just means a group of people all working together for the same goal or achievement." So no mention of young people, no mention of them playing a role in decision making, leading decision making. I mean, that definition might mean something to do with working together. It doesn't relate at all to participation, and we've written a paper on this, senior managers having a poor understanding of participation, that came out a few months ago in the British Journal of Social Work, that you can look up and have a read of. Very few of the professionals have been to any training on participation, so 2 of the 25 professionals we interviewed had ever been on training, and the IROs said in particular that the training for IROs generally was atrocious. I went to training a few years ago in Manchester. The training for IROs generally is atrocious. Another major barrier was high caseloads. So in this local authority, caseloads for social workers were between 22 and sort of 35 at the time that we were carrying out this research, up to actually nearer 38. But children in care social workers, probably around 25 to 30. And social workers and IROs, and indeed young people, all raise this issue of high caseloads, high workloads, very busy social workers. So this is a quote from an IRO: "We've got so many kids coming into care, they're trying to manage going out," when we say there, it means social workers, going out and seeing children in between reviews. "It's really difficult. You wing it and you know you'll deal with crisis, but for me that is what social work is all about." So this sense of constantly dealing with crises, even in terms of a planned meeting, which children in care review should be. And this is a quote from another IRO: "Social workers are busy, they're so busy. I don't mean just on the ground, but in their heads. They've got so many things they're carrying, so many pressures, they're not able to think ahead or plan ahead." And this led to some really tragic results, really. Reviews taking place on children's birthdays. We heard of 2 examples of that. A review taking place on a child's 15th birthday. I mean, that's totally ridiculous. Combined reviews with PEP meetings, so personal education planning meetings taking place at the same time as the reviews. So you'd have, 2.5, 3-hour meetings taking place, which clearly is not going to help the young person participate. And that led very much to young people being bored, walking out halfway through, and just a really lengthy bureaucratic meeting that didn't support participation at all. And finally, no care plan. So IRO said in this local authority, indeed the senior managers, one of them was aware of this, that care plans routinely were not in place for young people. If they were in place, they were often very out of date, very old, and they'd very rarely been discussed with the young person or parents. So really problematic in terms of lack of care plans in this authority. And this authority did get requiring improvement. I mean, when you look at this, you think, gosh, they're probably inadequate. But you look at this and they, despite having very few care plans, Ofsted said they are requiring improvement. So just want to talk about this barrier a bit more. What was the result of this lack of training, this inexperienced workforce, these very high caseloads? I would say it ties in with a point made by Donald Forrester around zombie social work. This is a quote from an essay he wrote a few years ago in 2016. He said, "In research, we frequently observe social workers doing a visit because they're meant to do one within a certain timescale, the stat visit. Their computer is literally flashing at them. They do the visit, fill in the form, and the computer stops flashing. But the visit itself is so often characterized by a purposelessness that leaves worker and family confused about what's happening. To me, this is symptomatic of a system which has developed an obsession with effective management without sufficient attention to the wider values and aims of the service, and it's like zombie social work. Moving and busy, very, very, very busy, without any sense of being truly alive." And I still hear this a lot, this sense of very high turnover of staff, inexperienced workforce, a focus, despite the Monroe review, being on bureaucracy, on filling out forms. In this authority, we did a separate study where we tracked the amount of time social workers were spending, a very large study, in front of a computer and with families. We found they were spending 80% of their time in front of a computer, typing up data. And what was it? That in itself isn't that extraordinary, but what was extraordinary is 70% of that 80% of the time in front of a computer was typing up data that was already somewhere else on the electronic computer database for that young person. So 70% of the time they were writing stuff up into forms that was already written elsewhere, that didn't need to be done. For example, when a child came into care, there were 21 forms the young person had to fill out. All that information was on just 7 of those forms. So 14 of those forms were completely pointless. And that's, that was a big problem. And we really got a sense of this going on, this sort of zombie social work. I want to read out this quote because, again, I think this quote is really powerful. This is a quote from a few years ago now, but it's from a social worker who came from abroad into England, and this was their experience of social work. Now, I understand that we no longer have initial and core assessments, but I would say this sense of counting and measuring, particularly focused on timescales, is still very much taking place. So I'm working in a factory. This is what the social worker said, new to England. "We produce initial and core assessments in our factory. Our management counts the assessments completed on a weekly basis and informs the workers of the results in team meetings and by emails. The workers don't seem to care about these numbers, but they preoccupy the management. There have been many changes in our factory in the past 5 years. The management has been replaced, the teams have been reconstructed, the machinery, workers, forms, IT systems saw great changes. The management measures, in percentages, the reports of initial and core assessments completed on time and compare these to other teams. When the team manager reports these statistics in team meetings, I can recognise how my body becomes tense and my heart rate increases, and I get very angry. I have voiced my resentment to this ritual, but it's ignored by managers and other colleagues." So there's this sense of constant focus on timescales. Monroe is clear. This is not all about timescales, it's about the quality of the work. A big problem with this is, in one of the authorities where we did research, we had name and shame lists on the board. We had social workers talking about team meetings would be taken up with a focus on, have you done the stat visit? Have you filled out that form? Very little discussion about the quality of the work, very little discussion about whether the social worker engaged the young person, how they'd engaged the young person. So there's this constant focus on the timescale, on ticking a box, and no real focus on quality social work practice. And that's pretty bleak. Gillian Roosh talks about social work being focused on doing. I mean, I would say that wider society is constantly focused on doing, not enough thought, not enough feeling, not enough consideration of thoughts and feelings. We're all under pressure, in lots of different roles, particularly social work, I'd say academia in some ways too, of doing stuff, of getting the box ticked. And that leads to people not spending enough time thinking and feeling, and the quality of the thinking and feeling. And a really good example I had of this is a while ago, about 7 months ago, I was giving supervision to a social worker. I was doing sort of external supervision, occasionally to a newly qualified social worker. And I said, talk to me about a visit you carried out with a family. Talk to me about a piece of work you've carried out with a family. Not something that's going really well, and not something that's really worrying, just sort of average. And she said, she qualified about 8 months previously, and she said, well, there is a family I've been thinking about a bit, because just I'm a bit worried about it. She said, I was newly allocated this case. The child was on a child protection plan. And the previous social worker had left very quickly, as was common in this local authority, left high turnover of staff. So I was under a lot of pressure to go and visit this family because they hadn't been visited for 2 weeks and the child was subject to a child protection plan. So what happened was I went and knocked on the door. Now prior to the visit, as I say, this pressure was intense. I'd gone on one visit actually and there'd been no one in. So the team manager said to me, look, you have to see this child. In fact, I was on the name and shame list on the board. She said I was also being told, being constant emails from managers, from the deputy manager, from the team manager, how I hadn't seen the child. And even the computer system, like Donald Forrester mentions, was flashing at her because she hadn't done this visit. So she goes and knocks on this door. She's very nervous. She needs to get the box ticked that this child had been seen. She knocks on the door and the mother comes out and she says, oh, I'm your social worker. I'm your new social worker. And the mum is angry. The mum says, look, you're the 5th social worker we've had in 9 months. Why don't you just leave us alone? You say my child's at risk, but then no one ever comes. You don't do anything. You know, the social workers leave without even saying goodbye or that they're leaving. I've got no faith in you. Just go away. And she says, besides, you look about 14. Please just leave me alone. So the social worker's there thinking, gosh, you know, if I don't get in and see this child, I'm going to really get it in the neck from my manager. I'm going to be in big trouble. You know, what's going to happen next? And says, you know, please, can I just come in and speak to this young person, speak to your child, speak to you. I won't be long, 10 minutes, then I'll leave you for another 3 weeks. And she says, no. She said, no, you know, I've had enough of you. I've had enough of you. You've done nothing for us. You say my child's at risk. Just leave us alone. Leave us alone. Anyway, so the social worker, may be a bit ill-advised to have done this, says, look, I'm really sorry, but you know, I'm going to get in trouble with my manager. I'm on the name and shame list. I'm getting these emails. You know, I just want to, I'll be 2 minutes, please, just bother me 2 minutes. And the mother's pretty, you know, thinking, what's going on? What are you on about? You'll be in trouble with your manager. It's ridiculous. A name and shame list. Anyway, she says, okay, she says. So she calls down to the corridor and she says, let's say, we'll make up a name, Jessie. Jessie's a 12-year-old girl. She says, Jessie, come out into the hallway. So the social worker sees someone come out into the hallway. There's sort of you can see them down, not who it is exactly, but there's clearly a person in the hallway. And the mother says, right, there you go, you've seen her, now F off. Social worker goes back, fills out on her form, child seen. You know, doesn't put much details about the visit, but ticks the box that the child has been seen. Now, what that means then is that the system is happy. So the manager, from her perspective, the child's been seen as safe. There's no need to do anything further with this family for a further 2 or 3 weeks. But of course, that child, we don't know whether the child's safe. We don't even know whether it's that child. It could be anyone. But that is because, and this wasn't a bad, terrible social worker. This was a social worker in a context and a culture of zombie social work where there was a constant focus on just doing, on ticking the box, and no focus in terms of meaningfully engaging and working with families, building up relationships with them. So what I would argue is that the state of children's social care in a lot of local authorities is very problematic and significantly worse than is widely recognised. Depersonalisation. I'm sorry this is a bit bleak, but this is important stuff. This again was a big problem in children care reviews, is that young people felt blamed during the reviews. They felt that the purpose of this review often was to blame them. They felt particularly foster carers and teachers, education staff used the review to blame them. Also, almost like saying, wait till your mummy comes home, wait till your daddy comes home, wait till the review takes place, and then we can, you know, get it all out, have a go at you. And I think this is one of the most powerful quotes I've come across in the research I've carried out. So I did a review the other day. This was an IRO. The boy was in year 7 with additional needs. There were 4 education. I mean, why there were 4 education representatives in this children care review, I'll never know, but anyway. There were 4 education representatives, and the big male teacher, head of year, wanted to take us through the whatever 28 incidents. And he was just a tiny little boy, very small for his age, with some physical disability, and I could just see him shriveling up. So how on earth can you have a voice in a meeting if somebody just says, oh, and on the 14th of the month you called your teacher an effing bastard or whatever? So this was a big problem. This blaming and shaming, this wait till your mum or dad gets home, I'm going to make your life a misery. Of course, why is a young person going to turn up for this meeting let alone have a voice and meaningfully participate in them. And foster carers and school staff, as I said, were particularly seen as using reviews for blaming. So very problematic finding again. One of the final barriers was there was a big disconnect between what social workers and IROs said was happening in meeting, or what they said was important to them, and then when they talked more in terms of the reality of the meetings. So at the beginning of the interviews, all the social workers and IROs would say, you know, this meeting's really important. It's really important that children in care participate. It's really important we hear their voice. It's really important we take their views seriously. They all said that, which you'd expect. Then, sort of halfway through the interview, I'd say, okay, so let's talk about the practicalities of the meeting. Who decides when the meeting's going to take place? Who decides where the meeting's going to take place? Who decides what's on the agenda? Who decides who's going to be there? And they would almost always say, well, the IRO administrative staff would decide when the meeting was going to take place. The IRO administrative staff would decide on the basis of a form that the social worker may have filled out sometimes a long time ago, who would be invited. The agenda would be set by the IT system, and the time would fit in with the statutory timescales to meet the statutory scheduling of the local authority, so they met the DFE targets. So what you had, the reality, there was a complete dissonance and disconnect between what the social workers were saying was happening, or at least what they said was important participation, and then when they talked about the practicalities of the meeting, it was a totally different story. Again, you know, very problematic. Final barrier was around care and control. So this was a really interesting quote from a social worker who was pretty on the ball, actually, pretty honest here. They acknowledged that children in care reviews, this was towards the end of the interview, were pretty tokenistic, as indeed was most direct work with families and young people. I think it shows, this quote from the social worker, I think it shows that a lot of what we can do can be quite tokenistic. You know, it's one thing going and getting the child's view before the review, but on reflection, that's still quite tokenistic. That's a visit to a child with a preset of questions for a meeting. Preset questions came out in the other research, standard list of questions. That isn't going to change in structure. So, you know, we can ask the young people these things. It's not going to change the structure of the meeting, and the actual issues can be pretty abstract and complex, and they're very difficult to explain to a child. So what another social worker said is, you know, if things are going well, they're calm, then we can look at participation. If things are in crisis or in any way difficulties, then participation goes out the window. It's just, meaningful participation just doesn't happen. So again, very problematic. A sense of, a paternalistic sense that social workers know best, professionals knew best, young people would be told of the decisions made. They might be asked a preset set of questions, but you know, those weren't probably going to play a major role in how the meeting took place or the decisions made at the meeting. The professionals would make those decisions. So again, you know, this was worrying. This was worrying. I want to say a few positive things. There were some enablers of participation. Particularly, the big enabler was where children and young people chaired their own reviews, and I'll come on to that shortly. But another key enabler was where young people had a positive relationship, particularly with their independent reviewing officer. And as I said, the 10 young people interviewed in this study, in this second study, were much more positive about their independent reviewing officers. Very high turnover of social workers in this authority, similar to the other one. Very high turnover of social workers, but IROs staying in place. And they felt, generally they were positive. They felt, yeah, she's, so this is a quote, this is from a young person who's 15. Oh, can I come to your room and have a look? This is what an IRO said, so we did. We just sat there and chatted for a bit, and it was nice, a bit informal and stuff like that. Yeah, so I'd say, like, we had a bit of a relationship, yeah, because she was bonkers, and I like that. So a sense of that you can have, you know, if there was a positive relationship between the young person and the IRO, that definitely helped them engage meaningfully in the review. This is another quote about a young person, about their review, about their independent reviewing officer. She was a lovely woman. It's just a shame, though, because I'd have liked to see her more outside reviews and catch up properly and have a chat. This was the problem. They all really liked their IROs, but they only saw them twice a year. You know, they only saw them through the reviews. Because caseloads were fairly high in this authority for IROs, 85, 90, they didn't have a time to go and visit young people between reviews unless there was a big crisis. So young people respected, they liked the IROs generally in this authority, but they very rarely got to see them. So, but at least there was, some positives there about that sense of relationship with the IROs. Very positive were the three, a small sample, very small sample. 3 of the young people of the 10 chaired their own reviews, and they were much more positive. So those 3 I mentioned earlier, they did decide when the review was going to take place, or at least played a role in that. They did decide what was on the agenda. There may have been 1 or 2 items that also had to be discussed, but they would definitely play a big role in choosing the main agenda items. They did choose who would come to the meeting, where it was going to take place, and they led the meeting. Like there was sometimes stuff that was controversial that needed also to be discussed, but they did play a role in chairing this meeting. And I guess this was one of the big positives of this research, is that where young people chair their own reviews, and I'm not saying that that's the only way to engage meaningfully with young people and ensure they play a central role in their reviews, but where they did in this small sample, it definitely helped. And I think at the very least, even if they don't chair the meeting, it is essential that they play a role in deciding where the review is going to take place, when it's going to take place, who's going to be invited, and what's going to be on the agenda. Okay, so I want to say some final things around senior managers. As I said earlier, we've written a paper for the British Journal of Social Work that came out a few months ago called Willful Blindness, Senior Managers' Views of Participation in Social Work. And I guess we felt generally that senior managers were pretty blaming of social workers. They didn't have a good understanding of caseloads, pressures. In fact, young people had a better understanding, which was a really bleak finding, of the pressures that social workers faced on a day-to-day basis than senior managers did. That's obviously problematic. And this was a quote from a senior manager: if everybody was great and good at what they do all the time, everyone was great and good, all these social workers great and good all the time at what they do, then things tend to be function, but the barriers will often be around incompetence, communication. Social workers who don't respond to you, it boils down to social work competence practice. So there was a sense of when things went wrong, it was because that individual social worker wasn't up to it. There was no sense of, well, what's the workload? Has that social worker got a caseload of 40 children? Has the social worker got ridiculously bureaucratic forms to fill out? Have they only qualified 4 months ago? Did their training properly prepare them for this job? Some central questions that the senior managers were just not willing to consider. They were saying this was individual, incompetent people who should have been able to do their job in 35 hours, and it was their fault that they weren't doing it. And that, as I say, was very bleak. And I would say this is an example of willful blindness, which is a concept that Margaret Heffernan has come up with. So senior managers choose, sometimes consciously, but mostly not, to remain unseeing in situations where they could know and should know, but don't know because it makes us feel better not to know. So having experience in this authority and others, you would say senior managers, look, caseloads are pretty high in this authority, not as a researcher, but in different roles I carried out. And often the view of, and I'm not blaming them as individuals, because the other thing I'll say about senior managers is over the last 10 years, they've been cut significantly. Okay, so in most authorities where you might have had 10 senior managers 10 years ago, you've now got 4 or 5. They're overworked, they're too busy. I don't want to call it zombie senior management, but you could say that. So they don't ask the questions. Often they don't ask about caseloads, they're not collecting that data. And then if someone's got a high caseload, you'll often hear the line, well, that social worker's got 33 cases, but they've got to close 7. What if they don't have time to close 7? What about if as soon as those 7 are closed, they're going to get another 7? But there's no real discussion about the complexity or consideration of the complexity and the realities of the situation. There was a significant disconnect in this authority between the senior managers and the social workers, and that was a big problem. Young people, as I say, had a better understanding of the challenges that social workers faced than senior managers, so a big problem there. We came up with some recommendations from this study. Most of it's pretty basic, if I'm honest. Let's stick to what the IRO handbook says. IROs have caseloads of 50 to 70. children, then they would hopefully be able to visit young people at least sometimes between reviews. They'd be able to do their meetings, spend more time with young people, be able to think of ways of managing the meeting in a more creative way. Crucial, social workers have manageable cases. I always think 12 young people is more than enough, you know, if you're going to be able to do effective work with families. But, you know, anything more than 15, 16, it becomes very difficult. And I've never understood why the central government has never come up with a cap. You know, you wouldn't have classrooms full of 80, 90 children. There's a cap for a good reason. Young people and professionals should receive training on participation and discussions about the option of chairing their own reviews. So do young people understand their rights? Do they understand the importance of participation and playing a role in those meetings? We should have senior managers, we should think of ways of senior managers linking in much more closely with frontline social workers. So senior managers spending time with social workers. I would say if you're a senior manager, every 3 or 4 years, I'd like to say it about academics as well actually, you go back into practice for say 6 months so you really understand what the realities is. If you look at the way, say, senior doctors work, consultants, they still have contact with, you know, patients. Most senior managers in children's social care don't have regular contact with people who use their services, and I think that's a big problem. We need to completely change the balance between time being spent filling out forms and carrying out the bureaucratic parts of the role. Constant focus, which Ofsted have, which you know, which we have to change around constantly filling out lots of forms, often with the same data over and over again. And we need to make reviews more enjoyable, much more positive, a celebration of the child's 6 months or year in care, more like a family group conference than a very formal meeting, say, or even more positive than a family group conference. So, final thing, points to consider. Is there anything from watching, from hearing this webinar today that you think you might be able to make some changes? You might be able to make some changes on a service level, on your individual practice, just thinking about, can we involve young people more in those essential decisions about where the review's going to take place, when it's going to take place, what's going to be on the agenda, who's going to be invited? Is there anything you can do differently? And I think we'll finish on that point. I don't think we've got any questions. No? Okay. Thank you.